Hello, and welcome to the Odd at Sea Debrief podcast. I'm your host, Casey Odd. This is my first debrief and sets the tone for all the ones that followed. I wrote it with the intent of conveying what life was like aboard the cutter and what was going through my head day to day. It starts out with me in the galley, just after I'd gotten off watch to get some chow and get another cup of coffee. I stepped outside to get a look at my surroundings and immediately realized that I was out of my element. It was my first time out of sight of land, and I had zero life experiences to fall back on for reference. I also quickly realized that it was likely the last time I'd feel that sense of raw newness about things, and I tried very hard to capture it in my letters home. It takes place as we transited the graveyard of the Pacific, just off the Oregon coast, on Wednesday, September 3rd, 2014. The ship was pitching pretty hard that morning around 0330 when I got to the OPSUN. After 4 hours of watch spent catching random detritus leaping off the chart tables and shelves, I headed down to morning chow. I finished what must have been my sixth cup of coffee since rising, poured another, and decided to head outside to greet the day. On the aft bulkhead of the galley, port side of the ship, there's a non-watertight door that led to the engineering vestibule. The vestibule is basically a multifunction closet, and the walls are covered in valves, sight glasses, gauges, and buttons. It's a very tiny 3x3 industrial space. On the floor, on the inboard side, there was a watertight hatch and scuttle that led down to the engineering spaces. On the outboard wall, there's a watertight door that opened onto the main deck. I explain all of this because transiting the engineering vestibule with only one free hand, the other being occupied by a cup of coffee, and a rolling, heaving ship is an exercise in planning, grace, and quick reflexes. Once in the vestibule, I had to actually set myself to open the almost 400-pound watertight door leading out onto the weather decks. Unlike commercial ships, whose doors have a wheel set in their center with all the locking hardware built into the door, Coast Guard cutters are the opposite. There's a single 2-foot-long lever on the side opposite of the hinges, and that actuates all the locking mechanisms that hold the door in place. It takes a bit of effort to haul it up into the side to unlatch all the dogs. And the dogs are the metal clamps that hold the door against the knife-edge frame. And like anything else on a ship, opening doors takes a bit of practice. In this case, the weight of the door became a real hazard in even moderate seas, so you had to time the opening properly and always maintain control of the door. I waited for the cutter to heave to starboard, to its right side. And when our inertia slowed and we were perfectly balanced before we swung back to port, I heaved the lever up and quickly grabbed the door handle. And keep in mind, I still have an open cup of scalding coffee in the other hand. Because if I let the door swing free, it could very well kill someone or at least severely injure them if it swung open, especially if they weren't prepared to catch it. Moving with the roll of the waves in the ship, I pushed. As I eased the door open, I was hit right in the eyes by the sun. It was peeking over the crest of a wave that was climbing up the back of this massive bottle green swell. The cutter passed the midpoint of her lurch to port. The wave consumed the sun to bathe me in that same beautiful green light. Then the door swung away and yanked me out onto the weather decks like a child being dragged through the department store by their mother. I looked up at the crest of the wave. And keep in mind, standing flat-footed on the main deck on a calm day, my boots are maybe 6 feet from the surface of the water. And I'm 6'2". This morning, the peak of the wave was level with the flight deck above me. Video and pictures would not have done it justice. I was wrong in my estimation of the previous day's swells and waves when I rode home to family. Those were maybe 8 to 12 feet. On this day, they were averaging 20 feet crest to trough. The wind was tearing their tips off and rolling hissing whitecaps. And standing there and watching long enough, I could pick out the different movements of the ocean. The swells were chasing the Arctic current down the coast, and the wind-driven waves were following them and traveling faster, climbing up and down the swells like children playing on sand dunes. So you could watch these two layers of movement in the ocean moving out of sync with one another. And occasionally they'd stack up and you get a higher wave or you get a higher swell. Or sometimes you get an especially low trough. And you had to learn to read that, which you did over time if you were on a cutter long enough. So as the cutter steamed south, the cresting waves would climb over the stern onto the fantail, the aftmost deck. And when they did crest, they'd form whitecaps at the peaks of the big rollers, high into the wind, and that wind would tear their foam away like souls driven from a body to become this ghostly mist that raced just over the surface of the water, adding a third layer of movement to the ocean. In a big enough ship, a following sea causes it to fishtail back and forth, and the cutter was big enough. So as her bow was pushed down by the swells rolling up under her stern, she'd overbalance and tip to one side. And this set up a slow, corkscrewing motion akin to a coin rattling to a stop on a desk. And pitch forward and to the right, and then pitch back and to the left. The cutter's 210 feet long. Interval between the swells was around 120 feet on average. So due to this arrangement of wave and swell, we were never quite dead level in any one direction for longer than a moment. And it's amazing how a person learns to anticipate and incorporate this motion into everything they do. From riding to walking to completing any kind of task. It's also entertaining to watch someone poke themselves in the cheek with their fork because they misjudged a larger swell. And taking a shower was sometimes tiresome because the shower water, the stream of water coming out of the head, would sway around your body while you tried to stay in it long enough to rinse off. And on top of all of this motion, it was cold. Not just cool and damp like the beach in winter. It was a cold that instantly seeped into your skin like you'd been on deck in a gale for an hour. My coffee had been too hot to touch when I got out on deck and was the perfect drinking temperature by the time I walked the 20, 30 feet to the fantail. At some point standing out there, the unpleasant chill just became one more piece of information. I was so busy compensating for the heaving movement and wondering which wave was finally going to climb all the way onto the fantail with us that the temperature became just a footnote. And the waves eventually did stack up enough that the fantail was awash. There was an even 6 inches of water sloshing around on deck back there with me. And keeping an eye on this, again, it's all very much brand new. I never stopped to think about the cold. I mean, I felt it, but at any other moment in time, it was only background noise, like talking to someone in a loud room. Once the sun got a little bit higher, it took on that pale imitation of sunlight you only see in midwinter. Too white, no heat from it. We were so alone out there on the waves, it may as well have been the middle of a vast desert. Despite the sun climbing a bit, it was still occasionally blotted out by the crest of a wave. So I decided to go stand on the bow and take in the view. I'd been awake for almost 5 hours at that point, and I was looking at another 11 hours in the windowless Opsin. And wan and weak as the sunlight was, I wanted to take the opportunity to soak it up. Watching the waves roll past the cutter and feeling the deck heave under me felt right. And I'm standing all the way forward on the bow with my hand on the jackstaff, which is the forwardmost flagpole. I'm as far forward in the boat as you can get. We took a particularly heavy swell on the starboard quarter, and the bow was suddenly pointed at us at a line well below the horizon. So I'm standing flat on deck, holding onto this flagpole, and I am looking down into the sea. That's how far forward we were pitched. And I watched my coffee gently roll out of my cup and stream out over the rail of the cutter and into the sea without ever touching my fingers or the boat. I decided it was time to go inside. End of brief. Footnotes. This is the part of the podcast where I go over all the technical terms, jargon, and acronyms I use in the debrief. If you're not interested in the gritty details of shipboard life, feel free to skip to the next debrief. If you're into that sort of thing or just a little bit curious about some of the terms they used, stick around for a few minutes. Graveyard of the Pacific. This is a stretch of ocean that runs from the southern Canadian Pacific coast all the way down to northern California. And it is characterized by sudden changes in weather, strong currents, heavy seas, unforgiving cliffs on the coast, and more than 2,000 wrecks that have been recorded in that region. Something like 700 lives lost since we've been keeping records, well over 2,000 ships. It is a dangerous stretch of ocean on the best of days. OPCEN, also called CIC or Combat. OPCEN is short for Operations Center. CIC is short for Combat Information Center, and that gets shortened to just Combat. It's a radio navigation room. Technically aboard a 210, it is just an Operations Center. Only the larger cutters, because of some of the electronic warfare systems they have, are actual combat information centers. They actually have what's called a fire control system for some of their larger guns. We didn't have anything like that on the cutter. We were very much an analog boat for most of the time I was there. And like anything else in the military and the other services, it's got to have three names. So we interchangeably called it the OPCEN, we called it CIC, we called it Combat. Sometimes we even called it radio, just to keep the confusion down. Keeping with the theme of something having multiple names, the fantail is the aftmost working part of the ship. It's also the stern or the aft. If you're talking about left or right directions, it's also the quarters. So the fantail is the aftmost open deck. On our cutter, it was 6 feet from the water, give or take. On something like an aircraft carrier, it may be as high as 40 feet. It just depends on the boat. You heard me say quarters. That's the opposite of the bow. So if someone says port bow, they mean the left side of the boat up front. And it's typically for giving directions quickly. So you don't have to get specific about, it's 27.5 degrees to port. The person then has to turn forward, look at the bow, and then angle off 27.5 degrees to the left to figure out what you're looking at. If you say port bow, they know front of the boat, left side. If they say port quarter, they mean back of the boat, left side. Port is obviously left. Starboard is obviously right. And bow is also the fore. There's the fore peak, which is the forwardmost portion of the boat inside. Forward means the front of the boat. The engineering vestibule actually has the same meaning as it would on shore. A vestibule is just a transition space between inside and outside. And on the cutter, it was the transition space between the galley to the outside, from the outside to the engineering spaces, and from the engineering spaces to the galley. And unfortunately, it was like one of the only spots where we could put some of the equipment that's installed in there. So it's also a working space as well. You may open the door to walk out there, and there'll be someone with a clipboard looking at some of the glasses and oil sight gauges, making adjustments. You'll hear people use door, hatch, and scuttle interchangeably on a ship, especially if they're lazy. But those are all three very different things. A door is typically used for nominal ingress, egress of a space. So it's something you use on a regular basis. Hatches are set in the deck. Doors are set in the bulkheads. And a bulkhead is a wall. The deck is the floor. And scuttles are even smaller than hatches. So a door is typically 24 by 60 inches, give or take, depending on the size. Hatches are half that size and usually square, usually set in the deck. Scuttles are much smaller than hatches. They're round, anywhere from 18 to 20 inches, 22 inches maybe. Those are average size scuttles. They are bigger sometimes, but it's pretty rare. You have to be able to justify that size. And the reason for that is sometimes you still need to transit into and out of a space, but for safety and damage control reasons, you want to be able to close that space rapidly. And if the hatch or the scuttle is set in the deck, weight becomes a problem because now you have to heave that door up from its open position through 180 degrees and then close it. Well, some of these doors weigh 400 pounds. Since the scuttles are much smaller and it's a little easier to seal a round door than it is a square one, they have these scuttles mounted in the centers of the door. And I'll have another discussion about damage control later on, but doors are the biggest and they're usually set in bulkheads. Hatches are smaller, about half the size, and they're usually set in the deck. And then scuttles are very small round doors. and they're set into hatches or into doors, or sometimes they stand alone in the bulkhead if it's like an escape scuttle. Those rarely get used. They stay closed most of the time, but they are mounted in walls. Watertight versus non-watertight. A watertight door is meant to be a structural element of the ship. You can have a fire raging on the other side of a watertight door or flooding going on, and the door is airtight enough that it'll maintain the integrity of that bulkhead. In an emergency, the door can become part of the wall, and you don't breach it. Non-watertight doors in emergencies may as well not exist. If they're not going to hold back smoke, fire, or flooding, they are just there to keep the noise out and maintain some vague illusion of privacy. And that's it for jargon and technical details. If you have more questions, please feel free to send me a message on Substack. Please remember to follow me and share me with your friends and family that may be interested. This is the Odd at Sea Debrief podcast, and I am your host, Casey Odd. Welcome aboard.